Throughout history, Jewish communities have thrived in diverse locales, each presenting unique agricultural schedules. While keeping the prohibition against eating chadash proved feasible in some regions, in others, it posed significant obstacles to daily life. This class delves into the strategies employed by the Ashkenazi rishonim and the legendary Acharonim of Poland, exploring 5 approaches to justify non-compliance of chadash, particularly in circumstances where adherence would be exceptionally challenging. One of the greatest rabbanim who lived in Europe in the late 1500s and early 1600s is known as the Bach, and that's for his sefer, which is called Bayis Chadash. Bayis Chadash is the name of his commentary to the Tur, and he was a rav in numerous cities in Eastern Europe, and his name was Rabbi Yoel Sirkish. Rabbi Yoel Sirkish. Anyway, Rabbi Yoel Sirkish has a tshuva, Simen Mem Beis, in Shal's tshuva's Bach HaChadoshes, and he writes to the following individual, Kvoid Meirenu Hagadol Rev Liba. Now you can notice, Kvoid Meirenu Hagadol Rev Liba, the Rosh Tevis is Maharal, and the Leib, Liba, and the other variations thereof is the Yiddish nickname for someone who had the name Yehuda, because Yehuda is compared to a lion. And the assumption is, though it cannot be said with certainty, the assumption is that indeed the Bach is writing to the Maharal of Prague, the great Maharal of Prague. The only reason there's some doubt about this is because he calls him Av Beis in the Kehilas Kodesh Lublin. And the only issue with this is that we don't know. The Maharal was in a few different places. It's not known that he was in Lublin. That said, it's still possible because the years that this tshuva was written, either 1596, 1597, 1598, those years, we don't really know where the Maharal was. And so it is possible that at the time he was the Az Basin of Lublin. I'm not going to go too far into this. For the purposes of this class, we're going to assume that this is indeed the Maharal, because that's the best evidence what we have as of today. So it's 2 Gdei Yisrael corresponding with each other, but there are 2 very different places in their careers. The Bach is a relatively young man. He's around 30 years old, a little more, maybe 35 years old when this tshuva is, when he's writing to the Maharal. The Maharal is considerably older and much more of an established individual. So the Bach writes to him as follows: Shama Ozni v'ro'u einai michtav ma'alascha al dvar hachazan. I saw the letter that you, Maharal, wrote about the incident with the chazan. In other words, as we're going to see, the Bach got into a dispute with the chazan in this community, whichever community it was, and there was an issue. And the result was there was a standoff between the Bach, the Rav, the Av Beis Din, and the chazan, the person who was responsible for Kriya, and we also know that he was responsible for calling up and inviting people to get aliyas, and this was his role. So there was a dispute. So I'm here, I'm going to lay it all out for you from the beginning until what happened. So it doesn't look like I'm deceiving. I want to set the record straight, the Bach tells the Maharal. And here, in a very long way, he elaborates at great length about the dispute that he had with the chazan. He doesn't give a name to the chazan, but the dispute basically goes that he's a rav in town, there's a chazan here, and this chazan first started arguing with the Bach and giving him his opinion about how in yeshivas they shouldn't be learning Gemara. You don't need to learn Gemara, you need to focus on learning Tanakh. That was one issue that came up. Then there was a second issue that came up, and you continue reading in the tshuva. Then he started arguing with me about the prohibition to consume food that goes under the category of chadash. We'll learn more about this Isser in a few minutes. The Bach says, I'm not careful about chadash. V'ani yashafti lo lefi sumi, so I responded to him that belamdi Maseches Kedushin, that when I learned Maseches Kedushin, Nasati Libi, that's one of the chief places where the issue of Chadash comes up. Nasati Libi lachkar ulefashfeish bedin zeh. I investigated the din of Chadash, umatzazi heter, and I found a heter. So you want to know why me, the Bach, why I'm not careful about it? Because I discovered a heter. And so, but this turned into a fight as well, and he was telling me that I'm a terrible person. The Chazan is arguing with the Rav, telling the Rav that he's a horrible person for eating Chadash. Okay. That's why it's a widespread custom, because of the heter that I discovered. We'll see what that is later on. So when this happened, this was in public, in front of the prominent members of the community. Who are you? Bach. Remember, the Bach was a very young man. He's not the Bach that we know today. He's much younger. So the Chazan says, who are you to be mekel? You shouldn't even get involved in this discussion. Okay. Now what happens is that they continue having disputes. The next dispute they have is over a Sefer Torah, where the Chazan is reading the Sefer Torah. He decides it's possible. So they call the Bach, the Rav, to look. He looks, he says, no, it's kosher. So the Chazan insists that they have to put the Sefer Torah away, and the Rav insists that it's good, and they're fighting in public over this matter. Then there was another issue. We actually spoke about this once. And again, the Ramah once did a Kiddushin on Friday night. So the Bach also had a similar situation where there was a dispute, and the wedding was supposed to be on Friday, and it delayed. And B'Poyel, he decided, it was a Yesima, an orphan, he decided he's doing the wedding even though Shabbos already started. So there, the guy said, who are you? You can't be making Kiddushin on Shabbos, this is terrible. Then there was another incident where publicly this Chazan spoke against learning Gemara and against the Gaonim. That's the lashon that the Bach says. And so they realized this is ridiculous. You have this, he's a loose cannon in this community. So the Bach had a meeting with the Parnasim of the Kehillah, and they said, we're going to actually send a shliach that's going to go over to him and is going to reprimand him and tell him this behavior is not all right. Well, that didn't go over too well. He yelled back at the member of the community who came to give him the critique, and so that whole thing didn't work out. Then later on, there was another Maisa with another psul in the Sefer Torah, and here again, the Bach said it's kosher, and the Chazan said it was not kosher, and they had this issue again. Now the Bach continues and says, "Va'achar hamoyid," after Yom Tov, after Pesach, Kishahutar Chadash, Chadash is never an issue. Between Pesach and late summer, it's never an issue, as we're going to see. So now Chadash wasn't an issue. So then, Hischil b'takalasa v'kalkalasa, he started engaging in negative behavior, lahasev b'seuda v'chavura shekula sirikin, getting involved with people and with the social scene that was all emptiness. In other words, ladygayers, people who were wasting their time. V'halach b'rchovis kirya shikr, and he's walking in the streets drunk. Why is he walking in the streets drunk? Because now, because you could have Chadash, because you could eat the grain, there isn't a shaila of Chadash anymore after Pesach, so you could drink beer. Because he's drinking beer, he's living up on the drinking of beer, making up for his 6 months of missed beer that he didn't have from the end of the summer until Pesach. Now he's drunk. And halach v'diber divrei nivlus peh b'fnei nashim u'bachrim. Now he's speaking in front of young people, in front of women, and he's speaking inappropriately. And then, remember I said a moment ago that they had the final issue where it all came to a head was when, again, there was a psul in the Sefer Torah, or the Chazan said there was a psul in the Sefer Torah, and the Bach said never happened. So at the scene, they're both standing at the bima, and the Bach turns to him and says, I can't handle it. I can't handle this anymore. Again and again and again, so much unwillingness to accept the morus and the authority of the Rav. So the Bach said, you're a ben nidui. You're a person who belongs in excommunication. So the guy answered back to the Rav, V'chazan Heshiv, all this the Bach is right into the Maral. V'chazan Heshiv, ata ben nidui. No, you're a nidui. Lama ata shoyse chadash, you're drinking chadash. Again, it's mostly here, it's an issue of the beer, which comes from barley. Ata choylek al kol hagoinim ha'oisrim chadash. This is the story that happened sometime in the mid-1590s in some Central European or Eastern European community where the Bach was a Rav at the time. It's not entirely clear where he was. The Maral, what happened was that during this dispute, the Parnasim basically sent a letter to the Maharal, who was the Gadol, if assuming it's the Maharal, and I said we are, in Lublin, and they write to him, what should we do? On the one hand, we have this Chazan, on the other hand, we have this young Rav, but they can't get along, and they're fighting who's right. Maharal's letter back was basically looking at both of these people as great Talmid Chachamim. The Bach is a great Talmid Chacham, and this Chazan is a great Talmid Chacham. And so it's a very balanced type of response. When the Bach saw that the Parnasim of the community showed him the letter, obviously, he was very agitated by that. He's like, I'm the Bach, I'm a Rav, I'm not a lowlife. This person is a lowlife. How could the Maharal have adjudicated this case from afar without really knowing? And that's the function of this whole Siman Mem Beis, is where the Bach says, I'm going to tell you the entire story. What the end of this was, we don't know. In other words, what the follow-up, we don't have that information. But along the way, what do we see over here? We see that there was a major issue in the 1590s about Chadash. The Bach says he found a heter. We obviously want to know what that heter is. And more broadly, we want to understand why it's controversial. Clearly, someone is saying it's controversial. So what is the heter? Why is it controversial? And more broadly, what are we talking about when we're dealing with this prohibition of Chadash? So the Torah in this week's Parsha, and Parshas Emer, Vayikra and Perech of Gimel, Pasuk Yudalid, talks about the fact that on the second day of Pesach, the Korban Omer was brought in the Beis HaMikdash. A korban of barley was brought in the Beis HaMikdash. And thereafter, the Torah says, the lechem and bread, and we know that in Torah, when it speaks about bread could come from chameshes minei dagan, so it's bread and any bread that comes from wheat, or rye, or oats, or spelt, etc. The kali, even if it's not bread, but it's just flour, kali is flour, that too, if it comes from the chameshes minei dagan, but it's flour, that's also a problem. The charmel, even if it's not flour yet, even if it's fresh grain, the law is going to be the exact same for all three. What is this law? Lo yisaychlu, you're not allowed to eat the new grain that comes up in the spring. You're not allowed to eat it until you brought this korban in the Beis HaMikdash. Ad etzam hayom hazeh, until Tazayin Nisan, you're not allowed to eat it. Ad haviachem es korban elekeichem, until you bring this korban. Later Chazal said that when the Beis HaMikdash is kayam, when is it permitted to start eating the new grain? You're allowed to start eating the new grain from the moment the korban was brought. When there is no Beis HaMikdash, so then it's the day. Ad etzam hayom hazeh applies here. You wait for the day. There's a discussion, the beginning of the day, the later of the day. It's different shittas in the Gemara about it, which we don't need to get into. But without the Beis HaMikdash, you're waiting for the day. The Torah continues and says, that this is a law for all of eternity. And it says the words, B'chol moishvei seichem. So the question is, what does the words B'chol moishvei seichem mean? And this really leads us into a machlokas tanoim. One view would say B'chol moishvei seichem means wherever you live. Wherever you live, that could be Boston, and it could mean Eretz Yisrael, and it could mean Syria. All the same, the law is going to apply there. In simple words, that means the din of Chadash applies even in Chutz La'aretz. Or, alternatively, B'chol moishvei seichem does not mean that. Rather, it means in your dwelling places, meaning only once you're dwelling securely in the land, because everyone you did, kibush and chalukah, you conquered the land and you divided it, and everyone got their little parcel and they started living there. Only then, b'chol moishvei seichem, now you're a moishav. So then the mitzvah of oimer kicks in then. So that is the two different interpretations of b'chol moishvei seichem, and we see that reflected in the machloikas that's in the Mishnah in Kedushim Perek Aleph Mishnah Tes. Says the Mishnah as follows: generally speaking, kol mitzvah sheitluya ba'aretz, any mitzvah that's an agricultural law that depends pashut on land, then it's only relevant in Eretz Yisrael. But a mitzvah that has nothing to do with land, observing Shabbos, putting on tefillin, having a mezuzah, so then that has nothing to do with land. So it's a rule. Then it's applicable in Eretz Yisrael as well as in Chutz La'aretz. Except, however, the Tana Kama here, the unnamed Tana, who's known as the Tana Kama, he says, Chut min arla v'kilayim. There's two exceptions. Arla and kilayim are land-based mitzvahs. Arla, the first 3 years of fruits you're not allowed to eat. Kilayim, the mixtures of two different types of species that we're not allowed to do. These two, although they're land-based mitzvahs, they apply in Chutz La'aretz. Now, if you stop here, what does this say? What's the implication? Chadash is not relevant in Chutz La'aretz. Why? Because he didn't put it in his list. It's a ground-based mitzvah. He didn't say it's negei and choslar. So chadash in this reading is irrelevant outside of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, when the pasuk says it's relevant b'chol moshvei seichem, it doesn't mean wherever you live, because it doesn't apply wherever you live. It only applies in Eretz Yisrael. So what's b'chol moshvei seichem mean? The other interpretation of b'chol moshvei seichem, the other interpretation meaning in Eretz Yisrael only after the Yidden started dwelling there in an organized way. This is the Tana Kama. However, Rabbi Eliezer, one of the Tanoim says, Af min ha-chadash. Chadash is another exception that it applies outside Eretz Yisrael. So this is a case of a machlokas Tanoim. But here's the catch. We have another Mishnah, Maseches Orla Perek Gimel. Mishnah Tes, look what it says over here. Ha-chadash asur min ha-toira b'chol makoim. Chadash is asur min ha-toira, biblically. B'chol makoim. It goes on to say that that's min ha-Torah, orla and kilayim. The fact that they're relevant outside Eretz Yisrael. So orla is halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and kilayim, this is midivrei soifrim. But what's relevant for our purposes here is you have a stam mishnah here, no argument. It sounds like a universal ruling over here that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer. That's what it sounds like in this mishnah in orla, because you don't even have a dispute over here. And indeed, this led the major poskim, namely the Rif and the Rambam, to rule in accordance with the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer that Chadash is applicable outside of Eretz Yisrael min ha-Torah, as the Rif writes in Maseches Kedushin, V'kaim alon Rabbi Eliezer. We rule in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer, D'sasam lon Tana kavasei, because the Tana in Orla made a stam statement like him. When a stam statement means this is universal, that's why it doesn't even need a name. You don't need a name because everyone agrees. We all say this. We all agree with this. And so therefore, the Tanan Hasam, as it says there, Achadash Asur min ha-Torah b'chol makom, quoting this Mishnah in Orla, and this led the Rif, and presumably this is why the Rambam as well rules this way. Chadash is applicable all over the world. It doesn't matter where a person lives. It also doesn't matter whether the Beis HaMikdash is in existence or not. The same prohibition is in force. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, if we think about how the agricultural seasons work, this is not much of an onerous type of isser. Because when does grain start becoming ready? Mamish Pesach time. And in fact, the wheat is not even ready yet. The barley ersht is becoming ready. And then we take it and we bring the carbon on the second day of Pesach and we move on. So how many days is it give like, oh, I wanted to eat barley, but I needed to wait? 5? 10? It doesn't sound like a major imposition. And that's the only time all of the planting is happening for grain and for other things, but our purpose is grain. All of the planting is happening in the fall, growing through the winter, and so now what happens is Pesach comes, Pesach's mater everything. Good, so you don't have any problem. You don't have any problem. So it's not such a big deal. And the same thing seems to have been the case in Bavel. You're not talking about a long period in time in where there's food. Oh, you can't eat it yet. You need to wait for the second day of Pesach. You're dealing with maybe a few days, maybe not anything significant. But what happens when Yidden start moving to other areas in the world, and now the planting seasons change and they fluctuate, and every place they're different. And what happens if planting, as often happens, including in this country and in many places where Jews live, planting happens around Pesach time. During Pesach, after Pesach. So now, that wasn't covered. When is it going to be ready? That grain, when is it going to be ready? Let's say that grain is going to be ready in late summer. The grain is going to be ready late summer. Good, that's Chadash. So you need to now wait for the next year's first Pesach. So this grain that's ready in August to September, you need to wait all the way to next year's April for it till then it has the status of Chadash. You're not allowed to eat it. So this and what's the cutoff? So the way Chazal spoke about the cutoff is, as if the second day of Pesach comes and there's grain in the ground that already took root, it's covered. It's covered by this. So theoretically, if there was planting that happened 2 weeks before Pesach, even though it's not ready to eat till months later, it doesn't matter. Because Pesach, it purifies, so to speak, for the lack of a better term, it purifies any grain that's in existence. Whether it's in a shop, whether it's in a shelf at home, whether it's in a bakery, whether it's in the field, whether it's in a barn, it doesn't matter where it is. Or if it's still it hasn't been harvested yet, so what? If it's still growing, it's not ready, so what? As long as what? As long as it took root already. And so therefore, really, that becomes the cutoff over here. And so a lot is going to depend on when the planting season is going to be. Where do we see this issue coming to a fore? The first place we really see this issue coming out, and the poskim starting to address this, is in France and in Germany. The poskim living in the 1100s, they engage in this conversation. So, as we're going to see, each one offered a different argument for why, while on the face of it, it would seem that this grain is not allowed because it's maybe from after Pesach, it maybe took root after Pesach, but Poyol, the reality is that there were a number of different hetatim that were given. So the first heter, as we're going to see, is discussed in the Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol by Rabbi Moshe of Kutzi, and he quotes over here from Rabbeinu Yitzchak Berebi Shmuel. Rabbeinu Yitzchak Berebi Shmuel is the famous Ri. He is the famous Ri. Whenever we learn a Tosas and it says V'oimer Ri, it's referring to this Rabbeinu Yitzchak. He's a great grandson of Rashi and one of the most prominent Balei HaTosas who lived in France. And let's see what he writes. He writes like this. You're right. HaChadash hazarua b'chutz la'aretz aser. Chadash is relevant outside Eretz Yisrael. However, nonetheless, we don't have to worry about it. Why? Misafek ein lanu lesser. It's only a doubt, and we shouldn't rule out eating this grain due to the doubt. Why? Most of our grains are planted and take root before the second day of Pesach. Bein charfe, bein afli. Charfe is early planting and afli is late planting. What he means here is, if we're dealing with a fall planting, so then for sure it's in the ground and covered by the upcoming Pesach. When it finally becomes ready, it's harvested sometime in the spring, for sure it's covered by the Pesach. But even if it's afle, even if we're dealing with a spring planting, and indeed there was in the time of the Ri in France, there were regions where they would plant in the spring certain crops, so it's late in the season, but still it's before Pesach, it's 2 weeks before Pesach, it's 3 weeks before Pesach, so you're covered, so you're good. That grain, when it becomes ready in the summer, is already covered by the previous Pesach and you're fine. Then he goes on to say, that's good generally. However, there's two girsas here, either in Lombardy, which today is in Italy, or in Normandy. This is different girsas of how this quote it presents itself. So in these places, we're going to go with Normandy. In Normandy, which is in France, Ruban, today it's in France, then it was an independent kingdom. Ruban Zoyrin Shibayel Shul, they plant their oats Achara Pesach. Oh, that's a problem. You plant oats after Pesach, it's ready in September, you're going to have to wait all the way till Pesach till you eat those oats because it didn't have a Pesach to purify it yet. Vafal became mutter, it's still mutter. Why? The countries aren't protectionist. It's not like they say we don't outsource grain. No, they allow export, import, they allow grain to come from other places. It could come from France. The oats in France are, even the spring oats, are planted 2-3 weeks before Yom Tov B'derech Klal. So even though in Normandy it's done after, doesn't matter. You still have roiv. And this is his answer. His answer is that is there a phenomenon of grain, presumably oats, perhaps some other things? Is it true that some is planted after Pesach? Yes. But the roiv of the grain is from before. And guess what? Even when we're dealing with the Issa D'Oraisa, we have a right to say, when in doubt, you could follow the majority. Obviously, there are so many dinim when it comes to roiv, and we're not going to get into how roiv operates. For us, it's just to generally know that the Ri was very comfortable using this heter about roiv. And even in places where you don't have the roiv, in the sense of planting, because most of the planting is happening after Pesach, but you still have the roiv on the market. But mamish, when you go to the market, the roiv is okay because of the fact that it's coming from other places. This is in France. We get a very similar idea from the Ravya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi, around the same time, who writes as follows: Va'anu shoisim sheichar sa'oirim koidim Pesach. We do drink beer that comes from barley before Pesach. And guess what? Sometimes they were only planted in May, after Pesach. So why is this okay? How come I was able to drink that beer a whole winter? Nirali, the Samchinon, Aruba de Shichri. I'm relying on the majority of the beer, which is made from older barley. Either it's coming from last year's stock of barley, or it's coming from this year's, but it's coming from the portion that was planted before Pesach. So I have a suffix, a svek sveka, it's a double suffix. It's miuta de miuta, it's only a small amount, pashit, that is a problematic grain in the market of grain. And leichashinon, go ahead, drink your beer during the winter and enjoy because the majority of it is covered and is yashan, is not chadash. So too in places where they bake barley bread. In other words, you're able to see from the Ravya, from Elazar ben Yoel HaLevi, the main issue was barley. Where is barley? Barley is in beer, and barley also is in those places where they bake barley bread. So too, Samchinan Aruba, you could rely on the principle of Roiv, just like the Ri said you could rely on the principle of Roiv. Ravya says the same thing. However, this comes with a caveat. What's the caveat? And Ri, by the way, would agree with this caveat. What's this caveat? The caveat is, Roiv only means if I don't know. If I don't know, then I have a right to assume I'm going to follow the majority. What happens if you know for sure? This comes from Yankel's field, or whoever it is, and you know that Pesach, he was on vacation, he came back after and he started plowing. So then you can't say Roiv, you're eating from his field. Heicha, vadai, the heicha sheyadua bebirur aser, then it's prohibited. Then you're going to have to wait. Then you're going to have to wait till the time of the omer in order to eat this grain. So this is the first heter, as we see in the Ri and the Ravya. Now comes along the Rosh. The Rosh lived a little later, and he starts out in Germany, and then migrates and lives later in Spain. And he quotes this heter, Roiv. Maybe you have this idea of Roiv. But he says, you know something? I actually looked out this year and I noticed a problem. What does he say? I'll summarize outside. He says that he noticed in his language, she'inoi shalahem, their inoi, what's their inoi? Their fast. What fast is he referring to? So leading up to the Christian holiday of Easter, there's a series of 40 days fast. The holiday is called Lent. So he noticed that Lent ended mamish Pesach time. And he also knows, and that's one factor. A second factor, he said, looking at the soil, he was able to tell there was pashat due to the weather. It was impossible to plow the field before Pesach. So the first factor is, during a period of fasting, the Seder was, where the Rosh was living, at least then, it's probably when he was already in Spain, the Seder was, during the fasting, no one's working the field. They wait for after. They start the season. There's even a holiday in England called Plough Monday, which comes after these Chagis, after the holiday, right? So that was what happening there as well. So he's like, and that happened. That means all this work in the field, really, the spring round happened after Pesach. Also because of the fact that he says that the soil was just not workable at that time and they weren't able to plow the field. And in his lashon it was only a miut that was planted before Pesach. Okay, so now the Roiv fell away. How are you going to say Roiv here? Says the Rosh, an amazing thing. I did not come out and say an Isser in my community. I didn't announce that it's Asr. Why? Because I was afraid people weren't going to listen to me. And this moves us into a whole topic. It's really a topic for itself. Huge topic in halacha. That is, sometimes we say better for the Rav not to speak if you know they're not going to listen. So like this, they're doing it without knowing. And so they're like shoygig. But if you tell them, then you made it worse because they're like mazid. Do we say that? Do we always say that? Do we say it sometimes? Well, for the purposes of this class, the Rosh was very happy saying it in this case. He did not come out and make an Isser because he said, he assumed no one's going to listen to me, even though he didn't have any heter. Once Roy falls away, you don't have any heter. Why is no one going to listen to him? No one is going to listen to him, he's afraid, because he's dealing here with food. He's dealing here with basic staples of food that people need, and to come along and to say that these are unavailable could be a severe hardship for people, and he thought people weren't going to listen. That said, he continues in this tshuva and says, but when people ask me one-on-one, then I tell them the emes. And I tell them that this is what you need to do. You need to go to the experts in the community and you need to say, what's the roiv? In our town over here, what's the roiv? Was the roiv before the omer? Nishrash took root before the omer, or it was after? And you have to follow them. If they say roiv was after, then you can't eat this type of grain. You're going to have to figure out something of this sort. He continues to say that he remembers from his youth that this happened 2 or 3 times, very similar thing, that the Christian holidays matched up, bumped up with Pesach, which meant that it wasn't until after Pesach that the Christians started working their fields. And so you would think, he says, that my teachers would come out on Aser because there's no Roiv. Guess what? They didn't come out on Aser. For the same reason, and I'm following their particular model, but at the same time, I tell individuals that this is what they should do. In other words, what we're seeing over here is that temporarily, you had a heter here of Roiv, but some years that heter is not working. And that's what you're seeing by the Rosh. Now, a few hundred years later, the Shalah came along. He's writing in the 1500s, the 1600s, the Shalah, Rabbi Shaya Levi Horowitz. And he says that it's not just some years it doesn't work. In some places, it never, ever, ever works. And he's like really passionate about it. He writes over here in number 9, God gave me the merit that I am able to spread Torah and to teach Torah in all of the different countries. There was a time that the Shalah was in Poland. There was a time he was in Central Europe. There was a time he was further in the areas of Germany, and then later he was in Eretz Yisrael. I've been around the block, he says. And I saw that it really depends on where you live. He says where the Rosh lived, and where the Mordechai lived, and where the Ravia lived. In other words, Spain and Germany. He said, there you could have a situation where most of the spring grain is taka nishrash before Pesach, takes root before Pesach. You could have that. That's at least in some years it's shaykh to have that. But then he goes on to say, but in Poland, and how much more so in Russia and Volhynia, which today is an area in Ukraine, and Lita is Lithuania, there al haroiv, and not just roiv, the vast majority of these plantings is starting after Pesach. By the way, you could go online and you could look even today, check what agricultural cycles are in each one of these countries. There's a calendar, and you see that it's still very much that way for a nice amount of grain. Each one is different. Remember, there's barley and there's wheat. Each one has its own schedule and calendar. And therefore, to say, so then you're going to say, 1 second, but let's remember that he said, there's another nakuda, that don't forget about imports. Imports play a big role. So he says, do you know how the economy works? There's a reason Ukraine was then and still today is called the breadbasket of the world. The soil over there is very rich and very good for Dagon, and it was that way then and it's that way today. So he said it's a big lie to come and say that, Ukraine is importing. They're not importing nothing. It's all going exporting. They supply to the whole world. He says it's sheker meforsam to say it, and so therefore he basically negated this entire heter, although the rishonim that lived in France and Germany had it, and maybe the Rosh told us that some years it doesn't work, but at least it still worked. The Shalah now told us that where the majority of Jews are living in his day, in the 1500s and the 1600s, in Poland, Ukraine, whatever, he's saying this heter does not work. And so, as a result, they turn to see whether there's another heter, and already looking back to earlier in the period of the rishonim, we already see a different heter that goes in other directions. We'll get there in a second. But just for briefly, a comment on the reality in the United States of America, the way I understand it, based on the information that's provided on the website of the OU. They say as follows: rye and spelt is a fall grain, which means that by definition there is no chadash problem for rye and spelt, because it's planted, it's called winter, but it's planted in the fall, it grows through the winter, it's harvested after Pesach, it lived through a Pesach, and so therefore rye and spelt, you definitely have majority that is kosher and fine, and there's no issue whatsoever. On the other hand, barley and oats is the exact opposite, that they're almost exclusively spring grain, which means barley and oats, they're very, very often, and probably the majority, is not nishrash kodim Pesach, it's nishrash during Pesach and after Pesach. And so here, it hits the market when? August, September, Tishrei time, basically. And then it's that stuff, wherever it is problematic until you hit the next Pesach for about a 6-month period. So right now, no matter what you're eating right now, it's kosher, it's yashan, it's l'mahadrin, l'mahadrin. The issue of the question of the chumrah or not the chumrah, that pertains between basically Tishrei and now. So that's about barley and oats. So barley and oats, you have that problem. Wheat, there's 2 types of wheat. There's wheat that's spring wheat, and there's winter wheat. Winter wheat's not going to be a problem, taka, for the same reason, but spring wheat is going to be a problem for the same reason. Now, they also say there that once upon a time, in the United States of America, there was surplus from year to year, and so you had a lot of grain from the previous year that would come into the market the next year. And what that does, or what that did, is that it complicated the question of roiv. And basically you could say, yeah, I know that the majority of barley and oats it's spring, and so it's a problem. Yeah, but you have barley and oats from the previous year. And so maybe you have a roiv, number one. And number two is the fact that it was very hard to track what came from where flour was, where is it coming from, and when it was grown. But there have been significant changes, they write, in this regard. Number one, they say that America no longer keeps its surplus grain and it's shipped elsewhere. So basically, you don't get last year's supply anymore. And it's very easy. If you wanted to know where your grain came from, it's pretty much easy. Or put it this way: if a company that's producing flour with a hashgacha, the company can easily know when the grain was planted. The Rav HaMachshir can easily know. It's literally a question of a phone call, or sometimes just looking at paperwork. So then the question becomes, how do you have the heter of roiv in these cases? Roiv means, I don't know, I have no way of finding out. You have no way of finding out? Look at the paperwork, you figure it out. Ask a question, you can figure it out. And so therefore, in that sense, any grain that's a spring grain, again, which could be wheat and is by definition barley and oats, has this problem of doesn't have this heter anymore of the roiv l'choira, and beside for that, other poskim raise different issues. But either way, coming back to what we said before, the Shalah already hundreds of years ago pointed out the similar problem that we have today, and so therefore poskim pointed to different heteros. That brings us to the next heter. What's the next heter? The next heter comes from the Zerua. He also was one of the great rishonim who lived in the 1200s in Vienna. And he writes as follows. Chazinam, we see, shachorshim v'zorin lachar Pesach. I see that they're planting and plowing after Pesach. So how do you eat? I don't have roiv. And in fact, it's sveika d'araisa. Sveika d'araisa is l'chumra. You don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but sveika d'araisa l'chumra. So guess what? He answers as follows. I would like to suggest that we should paskin the halacha that chadash chutz la'aretz is actually derabanan. Here, he changes something in din. Till now, we've assumed the entire time chadash chutz la'aretz is a biblical prohibition. The first heter didn't touch that. The second heter says, let's touch that. Let's actually say that it is only asur derabanan, and he brings multiple rayas for why he thinks an argument can be made that in chutz la'aretz it's asur derabanan, but due to the lack of time, we're not going to be able to study those rayas. Okay, now, so he says as follows. Once you have this idea that it's asur midrabanan, so okay, the problem is that I did want to look at one of these rayas. So let's look at this Mishnah. Look at the Mishnah Menachis, Perek Ches, Mishnah Aleph. It says as follows. The din is the korban oimer cannot be brought from chutz la'aretz. That's the din. Now think about this, he says. If chadash, the iser, applies to chutz la'aretz, so then you can eat your cake and have it too. If you're saying that chadash applies in chutz la'aretz, then you should be able to bring the korban oimer from that grain. It's part of the same thing. You can't eat the grain until you bring the korban. So you say, oh, the isser applies there. Oh, but the korban can't come from there. He says, from this Mishnah, what does it sound like? It sounds like that chadash is not also min ha-Torah taka. And it's a stam Mishnah. It's a stam Mishnah. And so now we have a stam Mishnah that basically rules it's mutter. So how will we then understand the isser? We'll understand the isser as the isser derabanan. Okay, but Rabbi Eliezer didn't say that way. Rabbi Eliezer, clearly, if you look back at the Mishnah in Orla Perek Gimel, it said Achadash Asa min ha-Torah b'chol makom, that is forbidden min ha-Torah. Says the Zerua, Mishnayis v'Tanoim chalukim b'davar. We have a debate. Some Mishnayis pull in the direction to say it's Asa derabana. Some pull in the direction to say it's Asa midaraisa. And then he brings that we saw Amaroyim that hold on both sides of this question. Is Chadash and Chutz La'aretz derabanan or deraisa? The Amaroyim debate, Menachos Daf Samach Ches Amud Beis. We're not going to read it inside. And so therefore he says, Ika now, Ika veloy itmar hilchas loy kamar. There is no clear Gemara that says, and the halacha is like so-and-so. We don't have that. And so therefore, Ika shasat chak, and now it's shasat chak, it's extenuating circumstances, because as I said before, we need food. It's impossible to say we're not going to buy grain. And so therefore, what are we going to do? We're going to be soymech on this Stam Mishnah that he discovered for us in Menachos. We're going to rely on that. And the other Tanoim and the other Amoraim that hold Chadash, while it's prohibited, it's only Derabanan. But what do we gain by that? What we gain by that is Safek Da'iraisa is L'chumra. But Safek Da'rabanan L'kula, and you don't need Roiv. You don't need Roiv. All you need is doubt. So the second we have a grain, we say it could be this, it could be that. Even if you don't have a Roiv argument, you still have the ability to say we're going to go ahead and eat it. However, that only applies if there's doubt. And therefore he finishes this piece saying, if a Jew owns a field, he has no doubt. He knows when his grain was planted. And so obviously he's going to have to wait with that grain. So heter number one was Roiv. That didn't affect. That's a factual question. It didn't change any of the hierarchy of the din. Heter number two was Safek Darabanan L'Kula. In order to get there, we needed to actually change the hierarchy of how we understand the Mishnayos and the Gemaras to establish that there is at least a voice that says this is a din Darabanan, which then B'Shasat Chak will be able to rely that indeed it is a din Darabanan, and then we could say Safek L'Kula. This is the second heter, the heter of the Ur Zerua. However, there were those who went further to give additional heterim. Rabbeinu Baruch ben Shmuel was one of the Balei HaTosfos who lived in the 12th century in Mainz. He's the author of the Sefer HaTruma. And he also talks about this problem. And again, you'll notice that all of these rishonim are all living in the same general region. Ra'isi b'nei Adam, I see people, they don't want to drink beer that comes from barley because of Isser Chadash, because Nizra Achar HaPesach, ve'im mi she'yatirim, there's no heter. So he says, I'm going to give you a heter. What's the heter I'm going to give? I'm going to give a heter based on a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph implies that if a non-Jew owns the field, the whole din of Chadash doesn't apply. Why? Because it says over there that the Gemara is discussing when the Yidden came into Eretz Yisrael the first year, did they bring the Karbonomer? And if they brought the Karbonomer, where did they bring the Karbonomer from? The Jews didn't work their fields yet. And the Gemara is like, you can't take from a non-Jew because it says Ksir Chem has to be from a Yid. So the Karban Omer can't come from a non-Jewish field. So very similar to the argument we saw before. If the Karban can't come from it, then the Isser doesn't apply to it. It's the same argument that the Or Zarua made in his way, Rabbeinu Baruch makes in his way. If the Karban can't come from it, then it's because they're two sides of the same coin. And so therefore what do we see from that Gemara? We see, he says, that there is no Isser on land belonging to non-Jews. Misham yesh ladaktek, he says, the tfuah agdela b'yad goy ein esricha taras ha'omer. If the land, so now all of a sudden, you're living in France and Germany, a non-Jew owns a field, you have to worry about roiv, you don't have to worry about the seasons, you don't have to have the winter, barley, oats, it doesn't matter. A non-Jew owns a field, you're great, you're good, you don't have to worry about it. This, you don't even if it's vada, you don't even need suffix anymore. Or Zarua only allowed us with a suffix, or now you don't even need suffix anymore. No problem. But there's still one type of case that could still be problematic for Rabbeinu Baruch. And this is going to transition us from the third heter to the fourth heter. What's the problem? What if a Yid owns a field? What if a Yid owns a field in France and Germany? What is he going to do? You can't say it's not biyad goy. So none of them. Roiv, we don't have. He knows. Suffix, we don't have. He knows. Non-Jewish land? No, the Jews owning the land. So he goes, he says, I'll give you another heter. What's the heter is? Afilu migdela b'rishus Yisrael. Ata b'chutz la'aretz. Now we're in chutz la'aretz. And ein anu smuchim l'Eretz Yisrael. We're not next to Eretz Yisrael. Nira lahatir. I think this is mutter even for a Jew, because even though there is midaraban, shafilu midarabanan loy gazru, because even rabbinic decree in this matter they did not make in areas that are far away of Eretz Yisrael, similar to Meiser. What's he referring to here? There's Meiser men HaTorah in Eretz Yisrael. Then there's a Takanas Chachamim that regions that are near Eretz Yisrael, this was just in the Rambam Perek Echad a few days or weeks ago, regions that are near Eretz Yisrael, Hilchos Trumas, right in the beginning, regions that are near Eretz Yisrael have it midrabanan. Why? Because Jews are always constantly going from Eretz Yisrael to these places. It'll be where here you're keeping it, here you're not keeping it. So Chachamim made the rules in those places, but only in those places, not in further places. So if that's true for Meiser or Truma, why can't that be true for Chadash? Which means if you're living in France and you're living in Germany, so even if you're a Jew who owns the field, the whole thing doesn't apply to you, even midrabanan. And this is the fourth heter that Rabbeinu Baruch gave. And this is going to lead us back to the story with the Bach. If you remember, the Bach said that he found a heter, and this chazan in the community didn't like it and called him out for it. So the Bach writes about this in Yeridei Simin Reish Tzadik Gimel, and he writes as follows: Haminig pashut b'malchuseinu linig heter. In Poland, everyone is mater. And in fact, it's not only regular Jews, even very special Jews are mater. And he names two. One, Meirenu Harav Shachna, and Meirenu Harav Shloime Luria Zal. Rav Shachna, these are two of the great Gdolei Acharonim that lived in Poland. Rav Shachna was he didn't leave Svarim, but so that's why he's a little less famous. But he left many great Talmidim. Among them, the Ramah, for example, was a Talmud of this Rav Shachna, and Rav Shloime Luria is known as the Marshal. So the Bach here, they had already passed away by the time this is in the 1590s. So they had passed away 20 years before and 50 years before. So he's quoting, he's saying, I remember these great Talmid Chachamim and their students, Lo Hayu Oisrin. And they were Shoysen HaSheichar. Shanasa Mitzvua Shalo Yitiru Oimer. And I know for sure, it's like the Shalah said, it was barley that was planted in May. And still they drank it, so you didn't have, and they knew Vadai, that it was that way. Zulas mixas chasidim mikorov. It's a new chumrah, he says. There's a new chumrah that developed in the late 1580s and 1590s. The reason people are trying to be careful about this. But none of the Gdolei Ador back then were. And so this really means that we need to come up with a justification, the Bach says. And he's going to come up with a justification in a second. But I want to pause here and tell you that there was a Rav who lived during this time, whose name was Reb Baruch Bendit. And he wrote a letter to the Bach years later, in 1637. He wrote a year because he put his date in the letter. And the Bach, his letter is printed in the Bach's Tshuvas. And he says, I don't buy this proof that you brought from Reb Shachna and Reb Shloime Luria that they drank the beer that came from the barley. Don't get carried away with this heter. It's not such a good proof. Why? He says, because the markets are dynamic. Things are changing all the time. And he brings two examples. One example he writes is, I grew up in Lublin. And they used to make a beer over there, and he calls it Asu Maltzin. He's referring to the malting process, which is relevant to making beer. And they would do this B'chodesh Adar, which is springtime, March time, and they would call the beer Marz, he writes, in Beloshen Poland. In Polish, they would call it Marz, and indeed in German I found that there's a beer that's called Marzen because of the fact that it's processed in the month of March. And so that's why it's called that way. And he says, so I grew up with that beer, and it was really special. I came back to Lublin after being a year, away for many years, and I said, maybe I'm going to revisit my youth and taste again this wonderful beer and be reminded of this Marzen type of beer. I came to them, they say they don't make it anymore. Why don't they make it? They figured now it's better for them to make beer that is mostly wheat, not barley. Mostly wheat, not barley. So you see, the situation is constantly changing. So you saw Reb Shachna and the Marshal drinking beer. Maybe they were drinking it only from wheat. And he seems to be saying over there was no spring wheat then. It was only a winter wheat. It was only planted in the fall, and so wheat wasn't a problem. So you can't just go by what you saw a person. Did you really investigate to find out what the ingredients in there were? So I thought that was an interesting point that Reb Baruch Bendit wrote to the Bach in his day. But remember, the Bach thinks that they were for sure drinking what's problematic beer. So what's the heter? So he says, when I was younger, look at number 19. When I was younger, I was learning Maseches Kiddushin about 30 years ago. And I decided to investigate this matter. And I wrote to the Moira Gadol, the great Liba Bar Bitzalel. That for sure is a Maral because it's Liba Bar Bitzalel. Now remember, we already know that he wrote about this issue to the Maral, because we're assuming that the whole tshuva in the Bach Siman Mem Beis was written to the Maral. Here is his commentary in Yoredeya. It's very possible that he's referring to the tshuva that we have in Siman Mem Beis. I wrote to him, And I wrote my analysis about why I think it's okay to consume this food. And I also presented it to other Gdolei HaTorah. No one was able to knock off what I said. Loi hoya misha sasar es dvari. And what's the vart? The vart is the chadash einay noyeg l'Rabbi Eliezer ela b'shal Yisrael. Yes, the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, but it only is an issue if the grain belongs to a Jew. When it's coming from a non-Jew, it's a non-issue. This is Rabbeinu Baruch's first. Remember, Rabbeinu Baruch, our third heter, was Rabbeinu Baruch's first heter. Rabbeinu Baruch's first heter was that biyad goy eina tzricha toras oimer. So the Bach came to this conclusion on his own as well. And he goes on to say, someone that wants to be machmir la'atzmai, it's midas chsidis, it's great, but you're not allowed to tell other people because it's going to lead to fights. That's very interesting. You're not allowed to tell other people because it's going to lead to fights. And then he adds another thing. He says, not anyone can say they're going to be makbid in the issue of chadash, of refraining from chadash. You have to be misha horgul b'shar prishis. You're someone who, generally speaking, you disassociate yourself with the pleasures of this world. Am a forsum l'chasid. It's well known that you go l'fnim mishuras hadin. If you're so rashai linoig l'isra gambazu, then you're able to be strict here. But to be lenient in so many areas of Yiddishkeit and dafke this one, that I'm not giving permission. This is odd. This is very odd because I'm sure there are other places where the Bach said the din is A, and if you want to be machmir, do B. And I do option B, and I'm pretty confident that he doesn't say this everywhere. Oh, and by the way, but only if you're a Baal Madrega, then you could do B. So this is all the Bach in his commentary to the Shulchan Aruch. It's commentary to the Torah, not the Shulchan Aruch. It's commentary to the Torah. By his Chadash, he writes his heter, which is our third heter. We have 4 heterim so far. He elaborates on the third heter, that if it's property non-Jew, it's not a problem. But then we also remember we have his tshuva, and his tshuva to the Maral, he defends himself, all the things that he did about the din of the Sefer Torah. He writes at great length about why he paskined the way he did about the Sefer Torah, and about Chadash he also writes at great length, and he writes all of this. Remember here in Yeredeya he's writing, and I once wrote to the Maral, which very well may be this letter. Well, in that letter he also writes this. It's a chumrah. You could take the chumrah, but only if it's appropriate for you. Let's read how he words it in the tshuva. Look at number 20. You want to separate from it? God bless you. However, you need to be generally, habitually involved in pious activity. Unlike this deranged person, the chazan in our community, who's careful about chadash. Remember, he couldn't drink beer or get drunk all winter. But still, he isn't scrupulous about very important things. He gets drunk almost every day, presumably only after Pesach, and he speaks inappropriately. Here you see the background for what's going on over here. The reason the Bach was writing this, at least in the tshuva, was because he had a case where someone was basically elevating himself and turning himself into this whole pious chassid because of the fact that he refrained from eating chadash. So the Bach was saying you could take the chumrah, but this jerk can't take the chumrah. And that remained with the Bach when he wrote his Pirush in Yeredeya, that he held onto it, which is I find that quite interesting. Okay, now, did we solve the typical Jew's problem who lived during the times of the Bach? Let's say you were living in 1590, you say all is good? Well, not really. Only if you follow the 4th heter of Rabbeinu Baruch, which said it doesn't apply at all in France and Germany because it's too far from Eretz Yisrael. If so, then you solve all the problems. But if you only go with the 3rd heter, which is what the Bach's heter was, our heter number 3 is the Bach's heter, which was said by Rabbeinu Baruch as well, and that is Bishal Goy. If it belongs to a non-Jew, you don't have a problem. This didn't solve all the problems. Why? Because you had many Jews who, even if they weren't landowners in the typical sense in Ukraine and Poland, but they leased the land from the Ukrainian parrots, these absentee landlords. They lived in Poland, and they had these vast tracts of land, and Jews would be the managers of these land, and min hadin, and there's tshuvas about it, although they're not the owner of the land, for Chadash purposes it counts. It's you're renting the field, it's yours, and the grain therefore has a din of Chadash. So again, go through that Tatum. Roiv, you don't have. You know exactly what your grain is. Suffolk, you don't have. You know exactly what your grain is. Non-Jewish field, you don't have. It's a Jewish field. The only thing you have is if you say there is no Gzeira whatsoever, because only in Artzas HaSmuchas Eretz Yisrael. But as with all of these Atadim, each one, and especially that one, it's a huge Chiddush. To be Mechadish, that halacha on the one hand is like Rabbi Eliezer, but only applies in Eretz. The Rambam didn't say that. The Rif didn't say that. No one said that. And so therefore, it's a big chiddush. The Taz went in a little bit of a different direction to solve this problem, but he too also introduced a pretty big chiddush. Let's read inside the Taz Yeridei Simin Reish Sadi Gimel. Zok the Taz. The Yachol Liyos. I want to suggest, he says, let's change the order. When we learned the Mishnayos originally, first I showed you the Mishnah in Kiddushin that had the Tanakama, which is Matir Chadash and Chutz La'aretz, Rabbi Eliezer Aser, and then I showed you the Mishnah in Orla that the Stam Mishnah Aser is Chadash. Turn it around, he says. How do you know how this was studied in Rabbi Yehuda Anasi's academy, or how it was when the Mishnah was redacted, which came first and which came second? Turn it around. Say that the Stam came first. Orla came first. That's the Mishnah in Meseches Orla. Then after that, the Mishnah in Kiddushin came in. Oh, you have a machlokes now. Tanakama against Rabbi Eliezer. Once you do it that way, you pull the rug out from the whole assumption that the Rif made, that the halacha ought to be like Rabbi Eliezer because the Stam Mishnah Kavasei. No. The Stam Mishnah happened first. And then later, the Tanakama peeled off. And it's not just when Tanakama doesn't have a name, which means it's the vast majority of the Chachamim peeled off and said, no, we don't like this. And it was only Rabbi Eliezer that stayed with that original Stam. So if you turn that around, all of a sudden, we come, and so now the halacha is like the Rabbim of the Tanakama, that there's no Chadash B'chlal in Chutz La'aretz. Not according to anyone, according to Rabbi Eliezer, yeah, but according to the halacha, there isn't Chadash and Chutz La'aretz, even not the Rabbanon. And so now, just like the heter number 3, which basically meant even a Jewish-owned field where he knows everything, it's not going to be a problem, so too with the Taz's heter over here, but it's broader, because here it's even Mekaymes HaSmuchas L'Eretz Yisrael Mamish, I think he would say that this is the din. The Taz continues to say, obviously we don't know what comes first. It could be the Rif is right. It could be you had a machlokes and then a stam. And so then the Mishnah is paskening, the Chodesh is also b'chutz la'aretz. But it could be I'm right. We don't know. So normally what you do in this situation, you're machmir. But you're only, and you assume like the Rif. You assume first you had the machlokes, then you had the stam, and so Chodesh is aser min ha'toyra b'chol makoim, when you have the ability to rule that way. But at the end of the day, we don't know for sure. And so when it's Shas HaDchak, you're allowed to assume the other way around. When it's really, really desperate and bad, and we need the food and we need the drink, then you're allowed to assume we have the right to assume the other way around. And we'll assume the Stam happened first. And then there was a Machlokes, which means the Tanakama, which is the majority, holds that Chodesh is not Aser in Chutz La'aretz, even if it's owned by a Jew. And he says, we have a right to work this way because it's Shas HaDchak. His lashon is the Chayiv Shal Adam Talui B'Shia Sheichar Sa'oidim V'Shibay L'Shual. We live off drinking beer that comes from barley and from oats. Obviously, beer played a much more significant role in day-to-day life than it does today. It was also assumed that it had health benefits, etc., etc. So he says, the poskim that didn't say what I'm saying, the Rif. Where did the Rif live? He lived in northern Africa and he lived in Spain. They didn't have this issue so much. So he was able to afford going the other direction, which is the right thing to do. And like what he says about the Rambam. He says, but we are in a situation where we basically have to assume the other way around. And so the result is there is no Chadash in Chutz La'aretz in this regard. Now, these, I would like to suggest, are the primary sources. Anyone who'd like to learn about Chadash, these are the primary sources from the rishonim, as well as from the Gdolei Acharonim, namely the Bach and the Taz on this subject. But as I'm probably aware, so much has been written, analyzing each one of these Hatadim, building them up, knocking them down, what's good about them, what's not good about them. But this is a very, very good beginning in order to understand what's happening in this particular sugya. And now, let's try to wrap this up by talking about some Chabad sources. The Alter Rebbe, in Eirach Chaim, Simin Tov Pei Tes, Seif Lamed, brings the whole issue of Chadash. And after stating the general Isser, he writes the following words. Va'achshav ein ha'olam nizharin klal be'isser Chadash. No one cares about this. No one is careful. Now the question is why? If the Rif and the Rambam is right, that Chadash is Asr b'chol makom min ha'Torah, so why? So he goes, Alter Rebbe summarizes all the work that was done by the earlier rishonim and the Gdolei Acharonim. He says, Yesh alamdu aleim schus, and the first, Yesh alamdu aleim schus is Alter Rebbe's language of, this isn't really fully legitimate, but okay. It's a limud schus. So the first one he says, and he brings, is because roiv. Roiv of the grain is nishrash koydem ha'omer, even if it's spring grain, and so you have majority. Okay, but then as we know, some poskim said that that's not true all the years, and in some places it's never true. So Alter Rebbe goes on and says, Yesh alamdu aleim schus, you get another limud schus, and that is, if you're far away from Eretz Yisrael, then maybe the whole Isser doesn't apply far away from Eretz Yisrael, which was the second heter of Rabbeinu Baruch. Okay, but that's very, very controversial. So the Alter Rebbe then goes on and says, V'yesh alamdu aleim schus acher, and he goes and gives the other limud schus, this one from the Bach. Really, Rabbeinu Baruch also said it as well, hundreds of years earlier, that if the karka is non-Jewish, so then the issue of the prohibition of Chadash doesn't apply. So Alter Rebbe brings, we had 5 different heterim that we said. Alter Rebbe brings 3 of these heterim. Then the Alter Rebbe says as follows. Any person who really cares about Judaism, I don't know, is that the best translation for Baal Nefesh? I don't know. But we'll go with that. So, you shouldn't rely on these heterim. Be machmer for yourself. Now, Alter Rebbe realizes this is very difficult. You need food, you need beer. As much as possible. Because the majority opinion of rishonim and Acharonim is that Chadash is noyeg min ha'Torah, biblically, af b'chutz la'aretz uv'chol makom, af b'shal nachrim, even if the land belongs to non-Jews, and that's haskamas Rav Poskim. So if you're able to, please try to do that. This is what the Alter Rebbe writes, and the Tzemach Tzedek has a number of tshuvas on the topic of Chadash, and he adds a lot of important things that it's a shame we don't have the ability to do in the confines of a short shir. But he also concludes with the same thing, saying, these are wonderful heterim, they're limud schus. It's a limud schus. The best thing to do for someone who's machmer and a Baal Nefesh is that they should be careful about this. Recently, evidence surfaced, because there isn't a lot of talk about what Papoil Mamish did the Rebbeim do. Just recently it came to light that the Rebbe Rashab, it seems, was careful about Chadash, because in the Rishimis of Reb Baruch Shneir, the Rebbe's grandfather, in his diary for Chav Dalet Teves 1915, Tafresh Ayin Hey, he describes a scene that the cake was put on the table, and the Rebbe Rashab asked where this cake came from, where the lekach came from, didn't want to eat it. And he said to bring from the house, and the Reb Baruch Shneir writes, why? Because it was Le'inyan Isser Chadash. Because the Rebbe Rashab assumed that what was brought before him was, remember, it's Teves. This is the problematic time before Pesach, and so we see that the Rebbe Rashab was particular about this. What's the bottom line in Lubavitch today? So as far as I understand in Lubavitch today, Chadash is not something that people are particular about. The Lubavitch Achshenim don't insist on it. Usually they don't even write if a pizza or a bagel or whatever it is nizher from Chadash or not. There's been a movement over the last, 30, 40 years around the world in Chutz La'aretz to be more careful about this. And you see it on Ashkachas and in other things. That movement is a result of words that the Alter Rebbe said and the Tzemach Tzedek said, and that many other poskim said, that if you're able to, you should, and especially if these heterim don't stand on such firm ground, especially the points that we spoke about earlier, that now you could take a track where things came from, etc. But the bottom line is, I'm telling you the reality. The reality is, it doesn't seem like in Lubavitch anyone is in any rush to be careful about this particular din. There have been a few voices. Rabbi Chaim Rappaport wrote an article about 20 years ago why he thinks, based on all this. Sometimes you would have a tradition that said, no, al pi Kabbalah, it's an inyan not to worry about it. We don't have that. Or sometimes, yeah, really min adin, you should be careful about it, but there's a chashash that if you're careful about this, you're going to have another problem. We don't have that here, right? It's not like we have any language from the Rebbeim. I'm just saying to compare it to like Tcheles. There's a letter of Rebbe Rashab where like, yeah, I don't want this. And we spoke about it in a previous class. We don't have a similar letter to the Rebbe Rashab. Other Chassidus, other Kreisen do have that, where they wrote, no, you know something, we intentionally don't care. Okay. However they got there, it doesn't matter, but at least it was said by someone. We intentionally decided we no longer want to care. But we don't really have that as much. But so, some have pointed to the following Sikha Rebbe, from Acharonim Shal Pesach Tafshin Mem, as kind of justifying Chabad's apathy to this particular issue. So what happened over here? In an earlier Fabrengen, the Rebbe said that when the Yidden came to Eretz Yisrael, they didn't start Sfiras Omer right away. They delayed till after Kibush V'chiluk, until they conquered the land and divided it, and only then did the mitzvah of Omer start. So people wrote, what do you mean? It's actually a machlokes. B'chol Moshe Seichem, there's two views. One view is B'chol Moshe Seichem means you had to wait for Kibush and Chiluk. The other view says, no, B'chol Moshe Seichem, you didn't have to wait for that. B'chol Moshe Seichem means it applies all over the world. So the Rebbe seemed to go in one direction. Why did the Rebbe do that? So in the Fabrengen of Acharonim Shal Pesach Tafshin Mem, the Rebbe seemed to say that actually, when we learn the Alter Rebbe that we just said, it actually makes sense to reject B'chol Moshe Seichem in the sense of it applies everywhere, and to therefore accept B'chol Moshe Seichem as referring to Kibush V'chiluk, and so therefore, yeah, it makes sense to say as a default, no mitzvah of Omer or anything related to that until after Kibush V'chiluk. Why? Where do you get that from the Alter Rebbe? Because although the Alter Rebbe said that the din is Chadash is Aser and Chutz La'aretz min HaTorah, although the Alter Rebbe Taka said that, but let's remember, he also used the words that Rebbe said, V'achshav ein ha'olam nizharin klal b'Yisur Chadash. Now no one cares about it. And the Rebbe went on to say, and when you go on the streets of Brooklyn and New York, and even in Williamsburg, you're not going to find one person who's careful in Chadash, the Rebbe is saying in the spring of 1980. And if you do find such a Jew, Tavai Olav Bracha, I never found such a Jew. So what is the result? You have here an Alter Rebbe that says no one is careful about the Isra Chadash, and that is how people are behaving. So now let's look at that line of the Alter Rebbe. No one is caring about it. Let's look at our behavior. No one is keeping it. What does that mean? What does that mean we hold? It means we hold that Chadash is not Aser and Chutz La'aretz. It's essentially our behavior. And the Alter Rebbe's statement that that's our behavior tells us that we hold Chadash is only the Rabbanon in Chutz La'aretz, following one of the lines of the Heterim. And so therefore, what emerges from here? That how are you supposed to touch B'chol Moshe Seichem according to our behavior? Your behavior tells you what's the touch B'chol Moshe Seichem. It doesn't mean in Chutz La'aretz because we don't hold that. What's B'chol Moshe Seichem mean? Kibush V'chiluk. So therefore, the Rebbe said it ended up geschmack and good that I said that as the default, because that is the default in terms of the line of the Alter Rebbe and the behavior that we see in the world around us. So it's a fascinating thing, because if an objective analysis would seem to suggest that this is something people should become more careful about, the reality is that's not happening. Some have pointed to the Sikha where the Rebbe seems to definitely not be in a rush to write. The Rebbe's not lamenting it. The Rebbe's not saying if only this could change and hopefully the circumstances will change. The Rebbe seems to be very at peace with the fact that this is the reality. And some have said, that's good enough for me. And so therefore, we don't have to be careful or particular about this. I think that's the best way to understand the reality in our world today.